staff person there. So take it away, Judith.
So I'd like to invite the panelists to join me. And Cole, before you leave,
Yes.
what's the timing? When do we end this?
Great question.
Well, I think there's no better time that we could have planned to have this conference, because this is a moment where there's a tremendous need for a sense of urgency, clarity, and we need to take some immediate action. The administration has doubled down on the war in the wake of the elections. We knew the election results would mean a new drive to escalate the war in Syria and Iraq, but little did we know that the administration would announce this week that they were doubling the number of troops on the ground in Iraq and asking for $5 billion more on top of the $85 billion that is already in the pipeline for fighting wars. So we know that war is not the answer to the crisis of ISIS, and we are here together to spend a day debating, discussing, and exploring how we can fundamentally demilitarize U.S. foreign policy. So we're very lucky that Peace Action and the sponsoring organizations organized this conference, and we are very lucky to start the day with two speakers who are going to reflect on the document, the Foreign Policy for All, and then we will have some time to discuss with them our initial impressions of this document and some of the questions that it stirs up. Our two speakers, they have studied the trends of political movements. They share a deep understanding of the history of how the U.S. became the biggest arms dealer and war maker on this planet. They both have helped the peace and justice movement for many, many years peel away the falsehoods of the crisis in the Middle East. And so today they will reflect on this collectively produced document. The panelists will speak for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we will ask all of you to jump into the gumbo and join the discussion. Since we're going to be discussing a 21st century foreign policy, we're going to get a 21st century introduction of these panelists. So if you don't know Noam Chomsky and Bill Fletcher, then Google them. And take a Even better yet, go buy their books. They're out there in the lobby. Noam Chomsky, well, you know, he's an author, he's a teacher, he's a preacher of peace and justice. He inspires us to stay in it to win it, to stay in it for the long haul. And when it comes to ending endless wars, that's what we need. We need a preacher who can give some insight to keep us going for the long haul. And Bill Fletcher, well, I've seen up close and personal that Bill is not just a keen observer of social movements, he's a hands-on activist leader. He has the work that he's done in the labor movement, the work that he's done to strengthen and build up the left in this country, fantastic. But the thing you don't know about Bill, big fan of science fiction. And frankly, the left should study more what goes on in the science fiction realm. Bill and I share a love for Battlestar Galactica. Anybody here? Now, there's a study about militarism and what will happen if we somehow lose Mother Earth. And so if he ends his speech with, "What say you all?" you know why. No?
features of the American self-image is what's called the doctrine of American exceptionalism. It's often ridiculed, but there is an element of truth to it, an important element. The United States is exceptional in many dimensions, in its power, in its wealth, in its natural advantages, and in its security. In the early years, the United States was referred to as the dangerous nation, John Quincy Adams' phrase. What he meant is that those near the United States were in trouble. They were insecure. Native Americans, obviously. The United States invaded Canada several times, beaten back by the British enemy. Spanish Florida was conquered brutally. Mexicans were invaded. The United States seized Texas, conquered half of Mexico in what was described as one of history's most wicked wars by General President Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in it as a young officer. In 1898, U.S. power expanded beyond what's called the national territory. Caribbean, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii was stolen from its population by force and guile. The Philippines were invaded. There's thousands of people killed. The NSA system of surveillance was actually designed in the Philippines to control and undermine the population. They didn't have computers then, but they had the highest technology of the day was used and very quickly reapplied back in the United States under Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare. But the United States faced no authentic security threats because the regions it dominated, it ruled without serious competitors. In fact, it's interesting that the phrase national security was almost never used, was not used really until the 1930s. By the 1930s, the United States was becoming a global power that extended to the Middle East, reaching elsewhere. And that means if its dominance is threatened in great areas or large regions of the world, that becomes a matter of national security. And the concept of national security entered national discourse. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was actually the first president to use it in scattered ways. In December 1941, of course, the U.S. was the victim of direct aggression. But there are some things that are useful to remember. That by our standards, Japan was entirely justified in launching a preemptive attack on military bases in two virtual colonies, which it knew very well, Japan knew very well, were being prepared for a massive assault, quote, to burn out the industrial heart of the empire with firebomb attacks on the teeming bamboo ant heaps of Honshu and Kyushu, and to set the paper cities of Japan on fire. Quoted plans that the Japanese could read in the American press, and that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was, as he put it, simply delighted to authorize. By our standards, that certainly justifies a preemptive attack on military bases and colonies, far more. By 1945, the U.S. security had reached historically unprecedented levels, absolutely nothing like it in history. The U.S. had half the world's wealth. Its industrial rivals were devastated or destroyed. The U.S. controlled the entire hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans. That's an incredible degree of power and security. It began to decline. There's now a lot of talk of American decline. Actually, it began to decline right away. It couldn't stay at that level. But the point is that it was entirely natural with that amount of power for U.S. leaders to U.S. planners to seek to construct a global system that would be conducive to the interests that they represent, the interests of dominant sectors within the society. And that means the birth of multinational corporations and so on. But when the more you own, the more your possessions are threatened. And when you own everything, your possessions are threatened everywhere. So as U.S. security increased at unprecedented levels, so did the fear of attack. It was put rather clearly by Dean Resk. He said, today we can only be secure to the extent that our total environment is secure. And our total environment is the world. The point was made kind of plaintively by Lyndon Johnson, kind of a man of the people. He was addressing American troops in Asia in the mid-60s. And he told them, he said, there are only 150 million of us, and there are 3 billion of them. And if might makes right, they'll sweep over us and take all we have. So we have to stop them in Vietnam before they take everything here. That reflects a feeling that's deeply rooted in American culture and society. It goes far back. It's on to the present. They're threatening us everywhere. And that's understandable if we own the world. And that we own the world is taken for granted. It's illustrated pretty remarkably just in standard rhetoric. So take the word loss. In 1949, U.S. power suffered a severe decline. China became independent. There's a phrase that describes that in our speech and discourse. It's called the loss of China. The loss of China became a huge issue in American policy. It was the root of McCarthyism. Who's responsible for the loss of China? Went on. And John F. Kennedy was concerned about whether or not to escalate in Indochina. He was concerned about that he might be blamed for the loss of Indochina. And it goes right up to the present. And it's an interesting locution. I can lose my cell phone. I do it all the time. But I can't lose your cell phone. That's just a logical impossibility. And if we lose China, and lose Indochina, and maybe lose the Middle East, and lose South America, that simply expresses the fact that we own them. They're ours. And if anyone tries to take them away from us, they're attacking us. So we're under threat constantly. There was mentioned before that we have 1,000 military bases around the world, but that's necessary for our protection. If you own the world, you have to protect what you own, and that requires 1,000 military bases, preemptive war, the largest global terror campaign that's ever been conceived, Obama's global assassination campaign, and so on. A rather striking illustration of it is NATO. For 50 years, NATO was presented as necessary to defend Western Europe from the Russian hordes. So a very interesting question is what happened when the Russian hordes disappeared in 1990. If anyone believed the propaganda of the past 50 years, NATO should have disappeared with them. It didn't. It expanded. It immediately expanded to the east in violation of verbal promises to Gorbachev, and Clinton expanded it to the borders of Russia. It's now being threatened. An expansion is threatened to the Ukraine, the kind of heartland of Russian security, leading to the serious threat of potential world wars, not remote contingency. And the official mission of NATO, official mission was changed. It's no longer to defend Western Europe. The official mission is to control the global energy system. That means pipelines, sea lanes, everything in the world. That's NATO, of course, it's U.S. intervention force. Well, that makes sense if you own the world. We no longer have to pretend that we're defending ourselves from the Russians. We have to protect our possessions everywhere. So there is some truth to the doctrine of American exceptionalism, very significant truth. Overwhelmingly rich and powerful, correspondingly threatened everybody. And that goes back to the earliest days, when sights were set much more narrowly, of course. So one of the most disgraceful passages in the Declaration of Independence, which we piously read every July 4th, charges George III, King George, with having unleashed against us the merciless Indian savages, whose known way of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Written by Thomas Jefferson, a great intellectual. And as he surely knew, he was there, the reality was pretty much the opposite. It was the merciless English savages whose known way of warfare was this undistinguished destruction. And that was understood at the time. So the Secretary of War, First Secretary of War, General Henry Knox, understood, as he put it, that the colonists were carrying out the utter extirpation of all the Indians in the most populous parts of the Union by means more destructive to the Indian natives than the conduct of the conquerors of Mexico and Peru. 1794, George Washington called for the extirpation of the advanced Iroquois nation, and they were by no means alone. But nevertheless, Thomas Jefferson was able to write those words, and we repeat them year after year with noticing them on July 4th. There'll be a full page in the Boston Globe. That brings up another crucial feature of American exceptionalism, American history and culture. It's the safest country in the world, has always been, but it's probably the most terrified country in the world. And that also goes way back. There's actually an interesting book on it by literary critic Bruce Franklin, political activist. It's called War Stars. He studies themes in American popular literature back to the colonial days up to the present, TV and movies. And he finds one major theme all the way through. We're just about to be destroyed by some enormous, unimaginable powers. And at the last moment, we're rescued by a super weapon or a superhero. High school students went to the hills to drive out the Russians or whatever they gave. And there's a sub-theme. This enormous enemy that's about to destroy us is somebody we're destroying. So in the early years, it's the merciless Indian savages. A little later, it's the black slaves. There could be a slave revolt, and they'll kill all the men and rape all the women to defend ourselves. A lot of the roots of the gun culture, crazy gun culture in the United States, go back to that later part of the century, 19th century. It's the Chinese. These Chinese laborers, you think they're setting up laundries, but they're actually planning to take over the country. Jack London, progressive writer, once wrote a story saying that we ought to wipe out everyone in China by bacteriological warfare before they come over here and destroy us all. Go straight up to Lyndon Johnson and the rest. And that goes right to the present. So take Ronald Reagan, 1983. You'll remember he had to invade the nutmeg capital of the world, 3,000 people. But there was a threat. Maybe they might be building an air base from which the Russians could attack us. No one could tolerate that, of course. And so therefore, 6,000 U.S. Special Forces were sent. They won 8,000 medals of honor because of their achievement in overcoming the resistance of maybe 40 construction workers who were building a commercial airport, of course. That was after the U.S. refused to respond to a Cuban offer to negotiate a settlement. A couple of years later, in 1985, Reagan strapped on his cowboy boots and declared a national emergency because of the threat to our national security posed by the government of Nicaragua, a real threat. As you'll recall, he went on to say that Nicaraguan forces are only 2 days' march from Arlington, Texas. Now, people didn't laugh. This is a theme that goes right through American history, as part of American culture, right up to the present. When the U.S. was planning to invade Iraq, Condoleezza Rice, made a speech saying, next time we hear from Saddam, it'll be mushroom clouds over New York. The media immediately became hysterical about the threat. You look at fear of Iraq, it shot way up in the polls. The U.S. was about the only country in the world in which there was any support for the invasion of Iraq. There was some, Israel was some, virtually no one. But here people were literally terrified. And right to the present, let's say take the Ebola epidemic. 3 people have been infected in the United States. There's total hysteria. Millions of people are refusing to go to work, not send their children to school, not travel. There are powerhouses like Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they seem to be able to deal with it. But we can't. We are living in closed borders. One of the most influential people in the United States, James Hagee, preacher, just announced that Ebola is God's punishment for Obama's insistence on dividing Jerusalem. And you can't laugh. That's tens of millions of people listening to these things and taking it seriously. The gun culture is very much part of this. People are really terrified. If you don't have your gun when you go into Starbucks or church,